Hi, this is Brian Peterson, urban designer for the town of Chapel Hill. Welcome to Part 2, Urban Design Comments and Issues. In this lecture, we're going to talk about some basic concepts of urban design. It's a companion lecture to Part 1 of this discussion, which reviewed design character images that were done as part of the future land use map process. And here we're going to focus in on what urban design actually is to kick things off. So at the top you see a range of scales going from, on the very top left, the citywide scale through the neighborhood district to the street and down to the building. Now if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see that planning has traditionally been working at the scale of the city and the neighborhoods. Architecture, we often think of architects as designing buildings, and that is indeed true, but also architects sometimes design groups of buildings, and we have public spaces, maybe some streets in between, so they can do their work in that range of scales. And landscape architecture sort of spans from the building site, designing the site of a building, up to things that we find in neighborhoods and districts, like the design of greenways, parks, streetscapes, and things like that. Now, urban design sort of fits in the middle, and it's informed by thinking about the citywide scale and the building scale as well, but it's primarily concerned with this range from the neighborhood down to the streets, and it's particularly involved with placemaking. So in talking about placemaking, it's important to understand a basic concept of the way people relate to their surroundings, and that is that people in general prefer enclosed spaces. So here in the diagram, I'm going to use the laser pointer here on occasion to show where people are congregating. And you see that they are showing up here in between the buildings. It's kind of a basic human thing. We like to be where other people are. It's kind of a strength in numbers thing. It goes way back to our primitive instincts. And you see some folks that are way out here. And oftentimes when we're in the middle of a large undifferentiated space, we feel a little bit uneasy. And if enclosure is important to creating places, we have to look at how buildings can do that as they frame and define the limits of public space. And we call this idea defining an outdoor room. And a good way to look at how effective this is being done is to look at the cross-section through buildings and the spaces in between and see what shape they are and what the size is, and in particular what the ratio is of the height to the width. In these drawings, what we see in gray, this is kind of like a section cut through this public spaces. The gray represents the building facades here and here, and the street or the public space. And this is measured in a ratio of height to width. For example, here it's 1:1. So the height of the space is equal to the width of the space. In terms of what's considered good urban design, this is sort of like the ideal at 1:1, but it can get a little bit higher, a little wider. Here we see 1:3, which is often seen as good for creating a public square. And we also can look at how tall and narrow these spaces get. And we get up to the limit here of about 3:1. Height versus width is still being acceptable. Anything beyond that, it gets kind of canyon-like. In terms of width, we can often get up to maybe 1:6 before it starts feeling like these buildings aren't really forming a room, but they're just objects and they don't really define anything in between. Now, if you happen to have a situation in which it's way too wide in this area, you can use things within the space to help create these more idealized ratios. For example, here you can see how trees can be used to create within a very wide space with not very tall buildings enclosing it, to get more of this 2:1 ratio here. The buildings themselves can be shaped through massing to create this ideal ratio, in this case at the lower level. So this might be the first or two stories of the building, and here we get the 1:2. And then what happens up here is less important, because it's really at the street level that people feel the need for the most sense of enclosure. Now, if buildings are indeed these formers of space, what's important about buildings is their massing, especially in how they can do this. And so let's talk a little bit about what massing is. So generally, you can consider massing to be the size and the three-dimensional shape or forms of the building. And then there's a related idea of articulation, and that is how these forms are then subdivided down into smaller pieces to create what's known as scale. In these drawings, we have three images of a corner of a building, and on the left, we see what's being pointed out in red as the primary mass. And that, in a sense, is the big shape, the main shape of the building. And then within that mass, in the middle, we see these corner gables in this projection out here, a secondary mass, and then within the secondary mass, we have details like this. So it's this sort of nested relationships of parts that relate to the whole. When we talk about massing, we often use these four concepts. Upper left, size. This is pretty straightforward. That's just how big the building is. Say it's 40 feet tall and 220 feet long. Scale is the size of the entity relative to other entities within it. Human scale is a slightly different idea. That's the size of the entity relative to a person, particularly as it makes people feel psychologically comfortable in being next to an object. And fourth, we have this idea of proportion, and that's comparing the dimensions of an entity in some kind of a system. For example, height to width. And we already took a look at that in terms of how buildings enclose outdoor space. First, we're going to take a look at building scale. Scale is an idea of a relationship of parts to the whole, and we can see that shown in this diagram. And what we want to have in a building is a sense that there's this kind of breakdown from a main mass to a secondary and to a third, and that there's some kind of a observable relationship between these. And on the right side, we have a condominium building. This was in Chicago, not far from where I lived, right in downtown. It's along the river. And there is a high-rise building that's in the middle of the block. We can kind of see it in the background here. It's about a 50-story tall condo building. And then sticking out from the building 40 feet around the edge of it is this row of townhouses. That's kind of like a wrap around the parking. And here we see a good example, I believe, of this idea of proper building scale. So we have the main building form here that's kind of the orange box. And then projecting out from that, we have these vertical kind of extensions out. We see them along here. And then we have kind of a third level of articulation. That's this element around the entry. And then even within that, we have a fourth level of kind of dividing up the parts with this kind of like almost like an archway of stone around the door. Now going back to the character images, and we'll see some of them that I talked about in the other part of the discussion reappear here because some of the observations that folks made about those images relate to these ideas. So this was not an image that was very well liked by folks. And the idea was that it was too boxy, it didn't have too much detail. And I think what is lacking here is this idea of scale. When people say that a building looks boxy, oftentimes I think what they're referring to is it doesn't have this relationship of parts to the whole. All you have is this, the main shape. There's not too much else to make the building seem interesting with these different layers of relationships that are within it. We could also talk about the idea of how a building is massed and articulated in terms of whether it seems horizontal or vertical. Now, in urban settings, buildings traditionally have had more of a vertical organization, whereas in a suburban location, you may find that there's this much more of an emphasis on horizontality. We can see that at work here on the right. So here are two buildings. They're about the same size. This one has a horizontal emphasis, and what it has is a kind of base, and then there is a step back here and also one on the roof. So this kind of makes the building into three sort of horizontally oriented main massing components. Step backs are a great thing in sometimes making it seem like a building is not so upfront against the street. But what you have to watch out for is this sort of wedding cake outcome that we see here. Now, here's the same basic building, but instead it has a setback, which is like setting back the plane of the building to create a courtyard. And that allows this sort of tripartite division of the building into these three vertical segments. So why do buildings that are vertical seem to work better and be more of a part of an urban environment? It's because social scientists have discovered that what people find of interest when they're walking along a street, it changes. It's very boring to keep walking and it's the same thing. You like to see a change every so often. It's called just noticeable differences in the lingo of social scientists. And vertical buildings have changes that make shifts in what you see as you walk along more frequently than a building that's very horizontal in nature. And I think as we look at this image on the left, this is from the preference survey. This is one that folks didn't like. I think we see some of that at work here. There's way too much horizontality here. And you don't get a sense of this family of forms. You have an overwhelming kind of these horizontal lines. It looks very heavy-handed, and it does not have the kind of vertical differentiation in the sense that there are changes. It just looks kind of too big and overinflated for the site, I believe. So when we get these big buildings, often there's a desire to try to make them not seem so big. And a very good way to do it is to try to break the massing down so it looks like it's smaller pieces than this big building. But we have to be careful to not overdo it. So in the middle here, we have one building that's being broken down here with a strategy of lots of ins and outs. And there's also, with these different hues represented, possible changes of color and material. And it's easy to get carried away with this, as we see in this example here, where it looks like we have about 6 different buildings and even changes within the buildings. It's kind of a chaotic result. In the upper right, we see a more restrained approach where it's still trying to do a similar thing, but it's less extreme. And what's used here is a technique that's quite effective, and that's changing the heights of buildings every so often. When people look up from the sidewalk, they tend to notice the height change. It's the silhouette of the building. So if you change the height of things or vary what's up here on the cornices, it's pretty effective at making a building be broken down without slicing and dicing it into too many pieces. And we see here what may not be super outstanding architecture, but I think it gets to this idea of a very kind of deliberate and more subtle breakdown. And again, how the sort of interest at the skyline here, even buildings aren't that tall, helps to kind of break down the massing and scale of the building. Ultimately, though, if it can be done, if you have a very kind of big building, it's great if it can actually be broken up into separate structures that are related, as we see here, but then interconnected in somehow. And this is an example of an affordable housing project that does that in a very modern aesthetic. Let's talk a bit about human scale. This is scale that's a slightly different idea than building scale. This deals with how a building relates to the dimensions of a human being. So when we walk along a building, as we see here in these black and white images, it's very important that the ground floor have scale so that the pieces are broken down so that they relate to the dimensions of our bodies. So what we see here is that we have these articulations, these slots that are cut into the stone. It helps break a big piece of stone here that's probably 4 feet wide and maybe 12 feet high into what seems to be smaller pieces. So that gets at the heart of what draws us, and we feel comfortable along surfaces that have sort of dimensions that relate to our bodies. Think of a door handle. When you grab it, you know, your hand fits right into it. So that's like an immediate connection of a building to something that we can very much relate to. So in many ways, if you get the bottom floor right, it doesn't matter so much what happens up above. And here again, we return to our character images. This was a very well liked image here, and I think the comments were that people like the detail on it here, the ornamentation, these pediments. But if you look at this ground floor level, there's a lot going on here. And the plants are just sort of cap it all off with providing greenery right here where people can see it. And then again, we return to the slide that wasn't so much admired, that again, it does not have at the ground level that sense of human scale. Now, when we talk about scale, there's an important aspect to how a building relates to the street. And this character image is showing a multifamily residential building here. And there's, of course, the sidewalk. And as you look at this, there is, the building's very close, but what we have here is a sense of layers of transitions from public, that being the street, the sidewalk, up to the building. And in this image, we have 5 layers here that help make the transition. So we have this zone that's right along the street. And what doesn't show here is often we have parallel parking. That acts as another buffer from the traffic to make this a more welcome environment. We have the sidewalk. We have a very narrow strip here of low-level plants. We have a step going up, the planter along there as well. We have the stoop, and then we go inside the unit. And then even above the porch, we have a hanging trellis. So we have all these different layers of different green. And so in about, oh, this might even not be 10 feet of space, we have this complete transformation from public to private. And up in the upper left, we have a picture here of Jane Jacobs, very well-known social scientist and planner whose work in the 60s pointed out through her study of New York neighborhoods how important it was with this idea of eyes on the street. So in looking at this section, imagine that there is a living room here, which is true of most urban townhouses. The social spaces are in the front. As you're walking down the street, if you get into trouble, if you have to yell for help, you know that there's somebody right there who might look out their window, might be observing the street and call the police or come to assist you. So this self-policing idea here is all a part of this designing this transition from public to private very well. You can also see here this idea of how important the ground floor is. There is a change of brick or addition of brick here that helps define this street space. And then you pretty much don't need to worry too much about what happens, what goes on up above, because this is all where it really counts. Related concept is this idea of individuality of the units. In these character images, folks liked how we had this wall of buildings, but you can see each one with a slight change of material. Same thing here with these single family homes on small lots. Kind of the same building, but there's little differences in the vents here, changes of color for the roofs. And so a good concept is that when you have this row housing like this, you should sort of read as one thing, have some consistency, but you should be able to tell each individual unit, and you should be able to always find each front door. We also can notice in this image how important the trees are to form this space along the sidewalk and this transition between street and the unit. Trees are very important, especially their shape. So here we see trees that have a shape that tend to make this outdoor room. Whereas here, the trees are not so much doing that. They could be fine specimens, great trees, but it's not doing the same kind of thing. So the choice of vegetation in urban areas is especially important in considering this. Let's move to commercial retail street frontage zones. A well-liked image from the character survey, and it was noted how this just seems like a very pleasant place with ample room for amenities, shade, enticing retail that appears to be here. And when you're designing these zones, it's important to realize that there's a place for everything here. In successful environments in downtowns like this, you typically have a zone right along the curb, 3 to 6 feet, where you have street infrastructure. tree plantings, benches, and that sort of thing. And then you have from 5 to 10 feet a zone that's actually the sidewalk, if you will, for strolling. And then there is an amenity zone that is usually 5 to 10 feet in front of the store or restaurant, where you can find the seating and various kinds of accommodations or displays for retail. Sometimes it's divided off by some kind of a barrier there, and sometimes it's protected and kind of again enclosing this little room within the room with awnings and things like that. Now, another thing we can discuss with commercial storefronts is the whole nature of the facade. And in this preference image, we see one approach, and that's just sort of, you just put a bunch of glass there. And it's sort of what you see is what you get. You can see inside this whole store, especially at this time of the day, which is like the sun is just going down. But imagine if you're walking along here during daytime, and if this glass is dark, you're going to have a hard time seeing what's going on in there. And we do have this issue along Franklin Street in some places. You'll notice the dark glass in some of the storefronts really gets in the way of seeing what's going on inside. Here's an old time-tested approach of designing a storefront. I think we've probably all seen these in some cities walking along some older neighborhood shopping areas, where the facade has these deep display windows. There is a chance to spill some of the goods out onto the sidewalk, and here we only have about a foot that's being taken up, but that sure helps entice you. And look at this, you practically walk about a quarter of the way into the footprint of the building before you even get to the door. So this is sort of like the lure you in approach. Signage is essential to think of the fact that pedestrians are coming from different angles, they're looking from different viewpoints, and so we need signage that's seeable from across the street as you're walking over there. Also, this sign, which is a perpendicular or a blade sign, is one that can be seen as you're walking along the street. So you can see that as you're approaching. And then if you don't see any of these, if this is such a great street that you're not really looking much ahead, when you get to the window, you can look right at it and see, oh, I want to go into there. So let's finish up by moving to very large scale spaces. So these are public plazas, squares, things like that. And we could probably spend an entire talk discussing these, and maybe there will be another talk. I am hoping that we can continue these discussions with other topics of urban design. And so let's just touch on squares a little bit here. And the thing to remember about them is that the reason why people come to these places is to see other people. You can have great plants, wonderful landscape, but really it's all about seeing other people. And another important thing is that the edges of these spaces are particularly important. That's where people like to linger. Now, if you're going to have a successful space, you need to get people to come into it. And there's this interesting idea that people, when they look into a space, they like to be able to see if they can walk through it. I think it's kind of a primitive thing where, again, like we saw earlier, this sort of, people don't like to be out in the middle of wide open spaces. There's also this sense of, well, do I want to go in here if it's a dead end? Is it worth it? As opposed to looking into a space and seeing that there are multiple ways to walk through it, or perhaps there's a building lobby to go into. And I think there's something to this when we look at 140 Franklin, West Franklin, and I think this plaza, it has some issues in terms of what's happening in it, but also I think it might be affected by this phenomena where this back part of the plaza, you indeed can walk through there. We know that if we've been there before, but to the passerby, you might look at this and think, well, what's going to draw me in there? And is this kind of like a dead-end space? So I think we have a little bit of this phenomena that might be going on there. So if you want to bring people into the space, it's important at the edges to make it sort of a gracious entrance that provides some choice. So here we have the either or. You're either in the park or you're not in the park, and you have to make kind of a conscious decision to enter it. This is a more nuanced approach where you have a sense of thresholds and you can choose the degree of engagement within the park. It's kind of a blending of the two. And so you might stop here and sit, somebody comes by, you recognize them, you'll sit and have a conversation. Oh, let's go sit in the shade, let's go up here. Or you may want to walk up here so that you can see what's going on in there. Maybe you hear some music and you think, well, maybe I'll go up there and maybe I won't. But when it's like this, it's like you're very likely, unless you really need to be up here or know what's going on, you're just probably going to walk by. So how we treat the entrances to these spaces is critical. And then we have this idea of, what do we do with these spaces? And there are many great examples of spaces like this throughout history that give us some tried and true examples. And what you find is often the same basic pattern. And there are hundreds and hundreds of variations, but the idea is to keep an open middle. So here we have a public space that takes up a whole block surrounded by buildings and streets. But here we have the middle of it is pretty much open. It's subdivided into separate sub areas where there might be things going on, and then has trees all around it to define this open area. There is a feature here, and we may find features that are sort of either pieces of art or fountains. Maybe it's a cafe or a restaurant. You don't want to have those right in the center. It's best to have them off of center a bit like we have here. And then people like to sit and inhabit the edges. This is where you want to have your chairs, tables, you sit under the trees and you can talk with your friends there, and then this is where kind of things happen. You could sit and watch what's going on. And we see that in places like Lakeshore East. This is a neighborhood that I lived in Chicago. This was my building here. And it has that same idea of a central open area. This is where markets were held. The kids played soccer games with the cones set up, and there was a playground. And then around the edges where you would find a place to sit with a book, where there were fountains and other things. And here's a much more formal example in Wilmington, Delaware. I think one of the most famous spaces like this, and if any of you have ever been to New York and have visited Bryant Park, that is one of the greatest urban spaces in the world, I believe, with that wonderful central space and then this idea of these shaded spaces around it with all kinds of things going on in those tree enclosed places. And lastly, if you want to get people to enjoy public space, you have to give them a place that they can sit. And this is so overlooked in so many places. Some of it's because communities are worried about maintenance and about issues with homeless folks and that sort of thing. But very wonderful public spaces either have movable chairs like we see in Bryant Park here, or there is a plethora of 18-inch high walls, planters, surfaces, because a truism in urban design, if it's 18 inches high, people will sit on it. So this just kind of gets at the beginnings of some great ideas about urban spaces. And I hope that we can continue these ideas further in talk. And I leave you with a bibliography. These are some of the sources of information that I use for this talk. I do have some of these in my office. I'm kind of compiling an urban design library there, so feel free to stop by. And what better image to end on here with for a bibliography with what appears to be the world's largest bookshelf. And this is indeed a parking structure for the Central Library in Kansas City, Missouri. So with that, I thank you so much for listening to our talk today. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. And hopefully we can continue these and talk about some other examples of great urban design. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks.